Yeah, thank you, Matt. And one thing I should point out is that if somebody other than the speakers does not want to be recorded, that's part of the group, because there's plenty of authors, and just let us know and we'll turn it off. Okay, can you see that all right? We're basically very honored to have this program as our 19th PNWAS Zoom meeting. And the nice thing is that, let's see, why isn't that? Is that the nice thing is we can have people from all over the country in here at once, including from, you know, Dr. Audrey, Lynn from New York, and some people from Utah, Salt Lake, and so forth. But so there'll be a lot more people than this. So if you would introduce yourself, if you're part of the group here. And last week we had Ed Carrier and myself talking about our project of living off the land and 44,000 years of making a living off the Salish Sea. One thing that Dr. Lynn has, you have the Northwest Coast Hall, and Ed's archaeology basket is as you enter the American Museum of Natural History Northwest Coast Hall. They just remodeled. Here we have made progress. This is the draft cover of the book that should come out at the end of the year, and wanted to see what you thought, if you thought it was a good cover or not. This is the back with the 44 resources that Ed talks about in his own words, and we compare them to sites within archaeological sites within 20 miles of him. And the only change Ed wants is to have his middle name here, so it'll be Ed Eugene Carey. Any thoughts? Do you like that? I think the color's pretty good. Next speaker we have with us, Dan Miot is the longtime and former archaeology program manager for Washington State Parks, and he's given 7 PNWAS presentations, many of them workshops, like making atolls and throwing atolls, and but we really appreciate his presentation. He's in the process of replicating certain Northwest Coast subsistence tools and procurement tools, and this is largely for the Astoria Museum, Maritime Museum, that they're having him make these things. These are examples of his Dentalium broom, and this is the director, Sam, who's modeling this herring rake and how it used. Do you want to say something, Dan, about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dale. Real briefly, yes, that's Sam Johnson, the director of the Columbia River Gorge, or the Maritime Museum, excuse me, there in Astoria. And what I'm hoping to do is look at 2 pieces of Northwest technology, very important. My interests lie in technology, how things are made, what materials go into them, how they're designed to be used. And these 2 particular items were part of a commission for the museum. And it prompted me to kind of get into the topic and the issues associated with both of these tools. I think they're just fascinating, and there's a lot of interesting things going on with them. So hopefully I can bring to our next meeting examples. I'll show you the variety of the designs and styles, what goes into it, the types of materials, and of course, how they're used. So hopefully you'll be able to join us.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And he's a lithic technologist too. Our winter program is by Dr. Duncan McLaren. I don't know if he's here with us. Are you here, Duncan? Don't see her, but he's been working on this. It is Edziza ice patch up in central BC, which has an amazing preservation of even leather artifacts like this pouch that date back to as much as 7,000 years ago. Look at this, Dan. It's
Oh.
gorgeous obsidian. Is one of the main sources for obsidian throughout the West.
Wow.
And that's something. And then wooden fiber, and some of this is leather tying these materials together. So that'll be a really good presentation. A lot of what we're talking about was depicted in oil painting by Paul Kane in 1855. Here's, of course, the main feature, these hair dogs, wool dogs, but these looms, there was 4 of these per house found out at the Ozette wet site. So it's quite an industry. And a woman doing spinning yarn, we found 23 over 9 spindle whorls per house out at Ozette. And 23 means about 9 of these, and they're all wooden. They're all decorated wooden looms. Well, Kane painted this from sketches he made 8 years earlier. This is the original sketch. And you can see in 1847, when he drew this, he certainly got the loom well. The hair dog's not here, the woman spinning isn't, and the man standing over the loom aren't in this. But there is a hair dog in this picture. Oops, I just gave it away. Can anybody tell where that hair dog is? Yes. Now you can see one there that's not in his oil painting. And I got quite interested. This is actually Paul Kane's sketch that he used to add to his oil painting here. And you can see quite a bit of similarity. But out in Nia Bay, when I was working with the macaws on Ozette really during the 70s and maybe early 80s, I saw these hair dog type dogs throughout the community. So I started taking pictures of them. And this was a feral dog. This dog was not owned. He was down on the beach and ate fish when he could. And Audrey said they're going out there in about a week. You know, if we can take saliva from these dogs, we can probably see how much Indian dog remains. And I owned one. This is one I got as a feral puppy out at the Ozette garbage dump. As a puppy, it wandered away from its mom onto the road, and it was middle of winter. So we picked him up and carried him out to the Ozette site, and he was not tame, so he lived under the house. I'm having trouble keeping this under control, but he soon tamed up real well, and he was my companion for years. And some of you that have been on the digs knew Fred here, and I'm doing science on him here in the rock shelter. Steve, he's being weighed, and there's a scale, so you get that. But and here he is with a spruce cone in his mouth. But these are other dogs I took pictures of, and none of these are Fred. That's Fred. None of these are Fred. Sorry, this thing is acting up. But all these are other dogs at the school where I took basketry. A number of res dogs were all over. And one thing about the Suquamish, an elder by the name of Ellen Seigel George, she says her grandfather out of Suquamish said these hair dogs were all black. So there probably was some different preferences for dog color. All she said is if you mix it enough with fireweed, it turns gray. And Audrey was right. My dog was a real rascal. I got another dog from Nia Bay, Hilda, and they had puppies. So this is Fred's son and the 2 puppies. And and I don't know where they are now, but anyway, I think what would be going on is they would watch puppies and say, does this one have the hair quality? This one's probably doing pretty well for good hair quality. And here's where Fred is today in heaven here. But he may have had those qualities. Now, let me introduce everybody for this amazing talk. We certainly are pleased to have Dr. Audrey Lynn from New York. She's a PhD and works with the American Museum of Natural History in New York, like I mentioned. 2020, she got her PhD from the University of Oxford, and with evolutionary biology, zoology thesis, and it's interpreting patterns in transcriptomes. See, I can't ever get a word. And ancient DNA from next generation sequencing data. 2014, University College London, Masters of Science in Infectious and Immunity, and then in 2012, she got her Bachelor of Science from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with an anthropology minor, if I can point out. She's certainly involved with a number of professional affiliations, and that's the Association for Women in Science, International Society for Biomolecular Archaeology, North American Society for Bat Research, and we saw that, and the Society for Molecular Biology and Evolution, and the Society for the Study of Evolution. And she's been to a number of conferences. Last year, the Society for Molecular Biology and Evolution was in Italy, and she's presented integrating genomics and indigenous knowledge to eliminate the life, history, and loss of Coast Salish woolly dogs. In 2023, I missed this. This is at the Society for American Archaeology, and I'm sure with Ian. She gave the talk, Mutton, and this is at Portland, Mutton in the paleogenomics of Coast Salish wool dogs. So getting quite involved with this kind of research, and we look forward to her working out here and getting out to the Macaw Reservation. Liz Hammond-Kaarremaa is with the Vancouver Island University and Department of Anthropology. Her degree is in educational technology. She's a research associate right now with the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. She's working there on Coast Salish wool dogs, spinning, and fiber, numerous publications, and specialty in social and cultural anthropology and ethnography. And Dr. Ian McKetchnie, I got it wrong. He's an associate professor. I've known him for a long time. He helped us in 2003 when our college sponsored the Wet Site Connections, an international conference, and he helped out as a volunteer to get involved and meet people in these wet site programs. He got his PhD from the University of British Columbia, and area of expertise is coastal archaeology, historical ecology, quite involved with ecology, and Northwest Coast zooarchaeology. You see his lab there, and certainly a coastal archaeologist interested in the history of food and settlement as a medium for understanding human environmental relations on the Pacific Northwest coast, and certainly a specialist in zooarchaeology, which is the archaeology of animal bones and historical ecology. He's quite involved with the Hackeye Institute. He's been involved with them for some time. They have an amazing magazine. You might have seen those articles on bulldogs they put out. and also with the Banfield Marine Science Center, which is out of Berkeley Sound, and he runs the field school out on the west coast of Berkeley Sound. So, and runs that amazing zooarchaeology lab. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lynn and get the program going. If you are a presenter with this group, please introduce yourself. Okay, well, thank you for coming from across the country. So, Dr. Lynn.
Hi, yeah, so I also want to introduce Dr. Chris Stantis, who is currently at the University of Utah. And Chris has done, she'll speak a little bit during the presentation on her work on this project of ours. And who else is here? Is Michael here? There's Michael Pavel, who is an elder and knowledge keeper from Skokomish tribe. He has been a really huge part of this wool dog project. And
I think Deb Sparrow is on too, but it needs a phone number.
Okay, and the amazing Deborah Sparrow, Master Weaver, from Musqueam First Nation, and Deborah she's on her way to covering the entire city of Vancouver in blankets, as I understand. So it's always an honor when Deb is present, because she's amazing. And
I interject there real quick. A friend of hers is Danielle Morissetti, who just put up a huge textile to make a Salish presence in the Seattle Convention Center. So if you have a chance to go see that, these textile weavers are really making an impact in terms of showing the Salish presence for thousands of years. Thanks.
awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to see Danielle's textile at the Seattle Convention Center. Hopefully we'll be able to see it, Liz, when we visit.
And we pass through, yes.
Okay, great. All right, so then I will start this. And yeah, I think that Liz should start first. So if you want to lead.
Go back two slides to the title slide. Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge that I am on Snuneymuxw territory, and that is a spinning whorl. That's actually a Snuneymuxw spinning whorl, and I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we are on traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw, and I'm sure most people are probably on Coast Salish territories. And on the right is a map showing you the language groups of the Coast Salish peoples, the different nations. And also I want to point out that there's a pinkish area, which is where you would find mountain goat traditionally, and the yellowish area is where you would find wool dogs. So we'll come back to that. Okay, Audrey, you can skip ahead a couple.
All right.
So in case people don't know the story about this one dog, in 1857 to 1862, the British and the Americans started to put border markers along the 49th parallel. And one of the people that was on the American survey team is George Gibbs. And he actually acquired a wool dog from the Chilliwack area. We don't know that the dog was born there necessarily, but that's where he acquired him from. And George and another fellow that we'll come to collected specimens and sent them to the Smithsonian or to the National Museum of Natural History as they encountered all these different specimens, mammals, plants, minerals, rocks, birds, fish, etc. And it shows you, this map is just showing you some of the locations that they were at, getting supplies and putting in the border markers. He acquired the dog in we think 1858, probably June. And then the dog died in 1859, and he had sent the pelt to the Smithsonian. Okay, so that's how the Smithsonian had this pelt. Okay, Audrey, we can, next slide. So the other person that was collecting specimens, he was the key specimen collector, was the doctor for the survey team. And when he wasn't doctoring, he was sending collections to his good friend and former professor, who was then the curator of the National Museum. And on August the 29th, he wrote a letter to Baird, and this is the letter on the left. And if I can read it and remember it, he's talking about they had been looking for a mountain goat specimen for 3 months. And finally, someone brought a specimen into Camp Skagit, I think they were at, and George Gibbs was there. And in his letter, Caleb Kennerly said, but most unfortunately, his famous Indian dog, Mutton, that was the name of the dog, or we're not sure, it could be pronounced Mutton, which is French for sheep, and there was a lot of French people in that area. Most unfortunately, Mutton went at it and ate the head off. He sent it to me yesterday, and when I opened the bag, I almost cried. Mutton was sheared a short while ago, and as soon as his hair grows out, we will make a specimen of him. And so there's a bit of a debate, did they, just wait for a few months for his hair to grow out, and then they killed him and made it a specimen, or what happened there? So we don't know, but we have some idea now. We think he died in December of 1859 at Fort Colville, because the only known mention that George Gibbs wrote in his notebook was that he didn't measure the pelt of Mutton because Mutton had been sick. So we think Mutton died of some sickness, and rather than some intentional collecting of a specimen. Okay, next slide. And that letter, it's interesting that Candace Willman, who's a historian and an author out of Bellingham, and she's written 3 books now about the women that married some of these people on the survey team and some of the early settlers in Washington State. And she was the one that discovered that Mutton was at the Smithsonian. They had somehow lost the paperwork, and Mutton was in a drawer. She was researching the wife of Dr. Kennerly and collected all the letters that he wrote to the Smithsonian. And then one night she read an article by Susan Crockford, who had looked at the dog bones. I'm sure Ian will talk more about Susan. And Susan, in her article, had said something about, we don't have any specimens of wool dogs. And this was around the year, just before the year 2000. And Candace, in the middle of the night, she said she woke up and she said, wait a minute, yes, there is, because I read that letter from Kennerly that's sent to Baird saying that he's shipping Mutton to the Smithsonian. So she got on the email or phone as soon as she woke up the next morning and connected up with the curator of mammals and said, where's Mutton? And he said, who? And he said, well, we don't have any numbers associated with him, like his field number. And she said, I've got that. So she went through her documents that she had collected, found the field number, sent it to him, and he immediately went out to the where they store a lot of the specimens and found Mutton in a drawer. And that was in, I think, 2010. And so that's how Mutton came back to life, so to speak. And here's that painting that Paul Kane did, as Dale already showed. And I think it's really interesting because of a few things. He's already mentioned them, but the spinning, it's showing you probably the plying. All Coast Salish textiles are 2-ply, and that whorl is used where the yarn goes up over a beam or a loom, upwards anyway, and then gets spun or plied together. The other thing that I find interesting is the blanket that he's got in the picture. She's wearing one as well. It's known as a hybrid blanket. It's got twining along the edges, the colorful parts, and it's got twill weaving in the middle. And there's always been some question, you know, did how many of the Coast Salish people actually made those kind of blankets, or did they just make twill, plain white twill ones? So this one was went from his 1847 visit to Fort Victoria, and so we know that either the Lungukan in Victoria area or the across the strait, the Sklallam, made those kind of blankets. Okay, next one. And then this blanket is in the Burke Museum in Seattle. And I had a fellowship to go down there and study all their Coast Salish textile related items. And this one I had seen on the online catalog, and I thought it was a Hudson's Bay blanket, so I wasn't that interested in looking at it, but they had laid it out, so I did. And I like looking at these holes because then you can get into the warp and take a look at the warp. And when I looked at the fiber, the warp had either elk or deer sinew in it, so I knew it was made in a traditional style and was probably quite old. It was also collected by Judge Wickersham, who in 1900 moved up to Alaska. And he collected a few really good quality items. So when I saw he had collected it, I thought, okay, this is definitely worth looking at. And when I looked at the brown or tan fiber, which is 80–90% of it, I thought, okay, that's not sheep's wool and it's not mountain goat. Mountain goat's very easy to identify. But what I thought it looked like was mutton, because I had visited Mutton a few years before. So I suggested that they get it analyzed, and they went to Elaine Humphrey, who ran the microscope lab at UVic, and she identified it as woolly dog hair. And on the left there is a group of our advisory committee, and we did a field trip and went down and had a look at the blanket. Okay, Audrey.
All right.
And this is Chief Janice George, and I think this blanket behind her is it might be Judge Wickersham's, or it might be the one from the Pitt Rivers Museum. There's two that have got practically the same designs on it, and they both have some human hair woven into one of these little triangles. But anyway, Chief Janice George is a very good weaver, and she's from Squamish. And she emphasizes that you should think of these blankets as merged objects. They're not just for warmth. She says they are alive because they exist in the spirit world. They are the animal. They are part of the hunter. They are part of the weaver. They are part of the wearer. So there's a lot of cultural importance to the blanket. It's not solely for warmth. And they use them a lot, even today, in ceremonies. Okay. And Michael, I know you're out there, so if you want to jump in and talk about this basket, please feel free. And Susan Pavel, who is a very accomplished weaver and is teaching weaving full-time or more at Evergreen College in near Olympia. And she's talking about how the dog was actually an emblem used in the baskets. Michael, do you want to say anything about the basket, or shall I continue?
Well, absolutely. One of the things that we always acknowledge is that baskets are not only functional, but they're such important entities to document the history of our people. And the care that we developed the designs to convey that knowledge was to ensure that we pass that knowledge to the next generation. So this is as much a book, a library, a document, and you read this basket and you look at the designs and you ask yourself, why was this entity brought to life? Well, it was so important. Yes, we're right. The woolly dog was such an important entity to the Tuaru, the Tawana, or Skokomish. And this basket is just one evidence of that. Thank you, Liz.
Okay. And I'll just also point out that along the rim is a dog or a wolf, and its tail is going down. And the ones with the tail going up in a curl are the wool dogs. And also the smaller ones are the wool dog puppies, and they're contained and protected by these pens. Okay, Audrey. And this is a delegation of Coast Salish chiefs that were getting ready to go to meet King Edward VII in England, London, England in 1906. And they're all wearing their blankets. And they're wearing their blankets as part of protection. So when they went to London, those blankets would be worn when they met people for protection. And I think Chief Joe Capilano's in there. Also, one of Simon Pierre's descendants. I think it might be Simon Pierre because he was the interpreter. There's a Cowichan chief and one from the interior too. Okay, next one. And this is Cilicia Charlie, and I think Deb, if you're there, correct me, but I think this is your great aunt or great aunt, Musqueam weaver, Cilicia Charlie spinning wool, and she's sitting on a mountain goat wool, or could be mountain goat and dog wool, we don't know, blanket, and she's demonstrating how to apply two yarns together. Deb, do you want to say anything if you're out there? Deb's grandfather remembers and told Deb seeing his mother and his aunts preparing, spinning, and weaving a blanket for his naming ceremony. Okay. Okay, so so I'll tell the story of how Audrey got involved in this. Audrey was at the Smithsonian on this, she had received this postdoctoral fellowship position, and was going to go in and take samples, DNA samples of all these birds and look for pre-1918 viruses. And then the COVID hit and the museum was closed and very restricted access into the building. So Audrey couldn't really access all the specimens she wanted. And she read the article in the Hakai magazine about the Coast Salish wool dogs, and read that there was a specimen at the Smithsonian. And so she went to her colleague, Logan Kistler, who couldn't be here tonight because his wife is expecting a baby at any minute. And they decided to, let's take a look at the DNA of the dog. And they approached me saying that they wanted to look at the DNA, but they wanted to do it in a culturally appropriate process, and also wanted to know how to share that information. So so my role was to bring some Coast Salish voices to the project. And the first thing we did was meet with His Honor Stephen and Gwen Point. And Stephen was the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia at the time. He was also the Chancellor at UBC. He was a lawyer and a judge. And he and his wife are from the Stala or Chilliwack area. So it seemed that like they were the perfect people to start with, and they gave us the go-ahead. And so then we formed an advisory committee of Coast Salish people, weavers, knowledge keepers, elders, people that expressed a keen interest and knowledge of woolly dogs. And then we interviewed people that had memories, stories, or concerns about how the woolly dog was portrayed, and all that information was incorporated into the research work. Okay, Audrey. And so this is the people that went to London to meet with King Edward and plead their case that treaties were not being made, and when they were being made, they weren't being honored. But nothing seemed to change. But anyway, there still is a lot of Eurocentric worldviews about that questioned oral history, and there's doubts about where the woolly dog came from. Some people suggested Japan in the 1700s, it floated over on a shipwreck, or some people said Southeast Asia or Alaska. And how far back in time that the dog existed, and yet oral history says the dog has been here since time immemorial. And even a really well-respected person that took a really good look at weavings, Coast Salish weavings, and wrote a book that came out in 1980. She questioned the spinnability of the hair, as dog hair would be too slippery or too difficult using a traditional spindle. Other people felt that if dog wool was used, then it was only used as a filler because the other fibers were more important. And that the dog disappeared because of Hudson Bay Company blankets came on the scene, and they were they're mass-produced and very easy to acquire. A dog wool blanket could take at least a year, sometimes more, to make. So they felt that the dog disappeared because they weren't needed anymore. And then there was a question that, well, if they are in museums, where are they? And I found that one really interesting, because even though the museums would say this is a dog wool blanket, or this wool blanket contains dog wool, there's still doubts. So those were some of the things we wanted to look at the research too. Okay, Audrey. And so we took what some people call a two-eyed approach. So the advisory committee was active in designing some of the questions and the areas that we looked at. And because it was COVID and because people were from the Washington State and British Columbia, we did a lot of meetings on Zoom. And in the top left, that's Missy, who is the curator of mammals at the National Museum of Natural History. And we're being introduced to Mutton and a village dog that was collected from Semiahmoo, which is where Blaine is. And it was collected in 1858. So same time frame, same geographic, roughly location as Mutton, so that Audrey and Logan could compare the two and see how they differed. So on the lower left, that's just a snapshot of us at a Zoom meeting Mutton. And at the lower right, we did that field trip to the Burke Museum to look at the blanket and at the basket. And we also had meetings where, for example, Ian McKetchnie came in and talked about his research. Somebody else came talk and diet. So we did a lot of online meetings. So everybody was learning at the same time. Okay, Audrey. Oh.
All right, Ian.
Oh, wow. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to be part of this work. And I just remember being floored when I heard the story of Audrey reading Hackeye magazine. And so I'm going to talk about the article that was featured in the Hackeye magazine in 2020 when COVID was around and prevalent. So I've been looking at bones here in the lab at UVic for about 20 years, but not enough bones recently. And working with my colleague Susan and Madonna Moss at University of Oregon, and we were looking at the history of zooarchaeological research that has happened where bones from archaeological contexts from animals of all kinds have been systematically looked at for their taxonomic specificity. Are they dogs? Are they canids? And so this big problem of what bone is it? How many bones have been identified and how did they get collected and so on. So we were looking at hundreds of reports, or thousands really, and of those there's 210 individual sites that have more than 50 identified mammal bones. And guess what? The majority in various parts of the coast of these archaeological sites with quantified bone identifications are of the canid category. So some collections like this have a lot of different specimens of different sizes and breeds and sexes and locations from which they are collected. But of course, the challenge of dog morphology is that they are wildly variable in size. So what is an ancestral pre-colonial dog bone shape like relative to all these wild breeds that we have today? So some of the researchers, dozens of researchers working over decades from Oregon to Alaska, are represented in the map on the left, and the bone percentages of those are the little sizes of the dots and so on. So I've zoomed in here and just added some text. The work that was featured in that Hackeye magazine article with the wonderful illustrations and the encounter with Mutton was mentioned by the writer for the magazine. And I'm just so excited to share how this was connected by Audrey and explored in a moment. But what resonance, of the role and importance of dogs in Indigenous worldviews and lived experiences. And, these are data points from hundreds of sites that are, of course, much more meaningful when you're considering the place name and the history of that site. But there is some gaps, as you can see, in geographic coverage where there's not a lot of information. And then we have the Coast Salish world, which is the most well-researched comparatively for this type of question, and an interesting sort of gradient between the lower mainland and the east coast of Vancouver Island and Puget Sound, where relative to other animals that have been identified from bone fragments, there's not as many dogs relative. So what are those patterns? These are all time periods. There's lots to explore here, but this is sort of the setting and the backdrop for the encounter with Mutton, because Mutton from Chilliwack, or the documentation from the US, what was it called? The Forward Station, where they were camping in Canada, but heading south to map the border with Gibbs and Kennerly. So that's just to the right of the image. And of course, there's not very many sites that have very well examined faunal assemblages from away from the coast because of that shell midden preservation. So this is just sites right on the coast for the most part. Anyway, and in the Nuu-chah-nulth world on the left of, in the macaw world, I've added, there are quite a few relative to other animals. So that is a quick synopsis of a sort of zoomed out all years, all sites that we could find. And of these canids, the vast majority were designated as domestic dogs. So we're concluding that the majority of these are dogs. Now, there's a few wolves, in a few sites. There's a few potential coyotes down in Oregon, and there's a few foxes, but that is one view. The next slide shows the 50 sites where we have bone measurements. So those are animal bones that have been, complete enough to estimate the body size. So that's the work that Susan, my colleague, has done with her osteometric studies of the animals. It's going to bring out the, small dog versus a larger dog. So this is a 3D print of one of the Coast Salish dogs from up near Qualicum, in Qualicum territory. But here is a map just sort of showing a reduced scope of where small dogs relative to large dogs, according to Susan's measurements, which were based on dogs from Rosette and dogs from the lower mainland, and from about, I think, about 22 or 24 sites in the 20 years since that book was published. There's been a variety of other work and effort towards measuring dogs, but here we have, again, a flat temporal plane where Mutton would be affiliated with this world in some way, and yet Mutton is a large dog, as Audrey and Chris may talk about later. So there's this interesting size gradient, and there's this sort of strain of Eurocentric genetic lineage from part of Mutton. So Mutton is uniquely large, but the majority of sites that have a lot of dogs in them in the Coast Salish world have small dogs in them relative to the large dogs. So those are depicted in the illustration from Susan's book here, and that we published in the 2020 paper. So I put a link at the bottom right if anybody wants to go check out that paper. It's open access. So that's my 2 slides.
Chris Stantis. Chris, are you there?
I'm muted, but I'm not anymore. Hello, everybody. I'm calling in from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes here in Salt Lake City, Utah. And my contribution to this project was sort of bringing together a sort of chemical analysis known as stable isotope analysis. Now, what this does, this sort of chemical analysis on pieces of people, including dogs, is hone in on how that person or how that dog lived their life when they were alive, right? And so we're asking questions to place that animal, to place Mutton in this instance, within his sort of physical and social environment. And very specifically, by taking small pieces of bone, you can see his little foot pad here in the lower right, and you can see that little piece of bone that's missing, equivalent to our sort of hands. It would be sort of this bone right here, where I cut a small piece out using a Dremel. And then I also took some small pieces of hair, which I'll talk about in a moment. But by analyzing these small pieces, we can look at what Mutton's diet was. Now, dogs, like humans, build their bones out of sort of this time average of sort of several years, right? Because we're constantly building our bones up from the things that we eat. And so we can place this time average diet of what Mutton was eating. And because the bones are sort of doing this kind of time average look, it's not just the time that he was with Gibbs and the survey team, but also when he was back in the village from where he came from. Now, whenever we do these dietary analyses, we end up making these sort of plots that you see here in front of you today, where we have carbon isotope analyses on the x-axis along the bottom. And that's sort of showing us differences between terrestrial foods, so foods that we get from the land, versus marine foods, so fish and kelp and other things like that. And then whenever we plot the nitrogen, this other sort of element that we build our bodies out of, when we plot that on the y-axis, going from sort of the bottom to the top, what we're seeing is sort of where somebody is in a food chain. If you remember a food chain, with the plants at the bottom having the lowest nitrogen values, the herbivore that eats only those plants having a slightly higher nitrogen value, and then going on up the food chain. Now, marine foods will have both a higher carbon value and a higher nitrogen value because they have just these big complex food webs of little fish being eaten by slightly larger fish, being eaten by slightly larger fish. So you can see that we can really embed mutton within that environment, within that wider web, within the 1800s. So when we place mutton's bone on that graph, you see that mutton, that purple triangle with his name, almost right in the center of this graph. And down at the lower left, we see what's labeled as late Holocene deer. So this is an example of what an herbivore living on the land is eating. And so mutton's not eating anything like what an elk is eating, which makes sense. Dogs are omnivores. But when we go up to that upper right, what we ended up seeing is all of this data, most of it collected by Ian and his team, of other dogs from roughly the same time period, not quite the same time period, roughly the same area, not quite the same area, but that sort of general Pacific Northwest, right? And so we see what other dogs are eating, and it seems to be this sort of more marine input, eating things like salmon, right? Things that keep dogs' coats nice and fluffy. And mutton's not quite eating like the other dogs. And that can be because of a lot of reasons. And there might be folks here, there are certainly folks from the project who were interviewed about the sorts of foods that mutton, as a known woolly dog, like what he might have been fed at the village, right? And while salmon and other things can be great for dogs in a lot of ways, we know it can also be dangerous, right, for puppies because of salmon sickness. But we know that things like elk or even terrestrial foods, terrestrial plants, because remember that dogs, of course, are omnivores. And so foods that would have been available there that people would have eaten as well may have been fed to mutton. And so that's why he has this very omnivorous diet, perhaps, compared to other dogs. Next slide. Now, what we also analyzed was the hair from mutton. So I cut a couple pieces of hair from sort of his back shoulder where it was the longest. And then what we can do with hair is it doesn't sort of average years, right? You are constantly growing out your hair. Dogs are constantly growing out their fur, constantly blowing out their fur, right? Often in the spring and fall, and leaving it all over our hardwood floors. But what's great about hair is that that hair that's closest to your skin is going to reflect your most recent diet. But longer lengths of hair going further out are going to reflect sort of later periods of life. And so what we were able to do was take that hair from mutton's shoulder and cut it into 6 pieces. And from that, we were able to sort of recreate those last few months that he was living with Gibbs and the survey team. And so whenever we plotted the carbon from that survey team, we sort of found that his carbon stable isotope values aligned quite a bit with some of the stories and some of, or not stories, the experiences written by the survey team in their writing. So if you look at the graph here, the hair samples go from hair sample 6. So that's the sort of piece that's furthest out from mutton, the tip of the hair, going over to hair sample 1, which was the closest to mutton's skin. So that last sort of bit of diet before mutton died. And we see this huge decline in carbon stable isotope values. And this sort of decline is something you don't often see, to be honest. This is a major shift in mutton's diet from a few months previous to that time around December 1859, when we know mutton was killed. And this admittedly took me and the rest of the isotopes team, the rest of the team talking about diet, like a little bit of time, because this is, as I said, like quite a shocking decrease in carbon values. And when we think of foods that would have been available sort of natively, we think of higher carbon values being associated again with those marine values, but that didn't really fit for a number of reasons, outside of what I included on this slide, since we don't need to get too into the chemistry. But something else that gives us these high carbon values is actually maize. And this, of course, would have been sort of corn supplies stocked by the explorers and by the white settlers coming in, and would have often been available at different sort of camps and forts along the way. And Liz did a really wonderful job as a historian and like tying all of these different pieces of evidence together, because we can see that in July 2nd, 1859, that the team restocked their supplies, which would have included corn most likely, or even pork, which was often, pigs at this point were often fed huge amounts of corn to get them fattened up quickly, right? And so these are two sort of different sources of what the surveyors would have been eating. And right? And in classic form,
in here, I think.
And in sort of classic form,
One cat chewing on the other cat.
they sort of fed they fed their dog what they had. This is known sometimes as like canid surrogacy theory, where you're feeding your dog much of the same foods that you have. And so mutton is reflecting what the surveyors had available. And along the way, the corn started running out. They wrote about this actually in their diary. And in fact, one of the people working for the survey team in December, he even wrote about how much he was looking forward to the corn mush cakes that were normally at Fort Coville, but even that fort had run out of corn supplies. So that's what sort of stable isotopes is able to give us, is kind of this picture of mutton and by proxy the survey team and how they lived as mutton lived until mutton died. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so another thing that we did in the study is do a scientific reconstruction of mutton, and for this we had enlisted the help of Karen Carr, who is she's a very talented scientific artist who primarily works on reconstructions of extinct megafauna like mammoths and other large animals that had gone extinct many millions of years old, and her work is seeing all over the United States, many natural history museums, including the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And so Karen was generous enough to donate her. I mean, it was kind of really wonderful timing as well, in that she had wanted to take she was planning on taking a sabbatical. In order to develop skills on illustration techniques, which she wanted to build up, including making realistic hair, and so when I had talked to her about this project and what I thought what she could, if it was possible to even reconstruct mutton, given from his measurements and other forms of evidence of what woolly dogs were like, if it was even possible. Well, So she was very excited to be involved. She also is a novice weaver herself and living in New Mexico, and she raises indigenous, I believe, indigenous sheep there too on her farm. So she was incredibly excited about this project and very enthusiastically jumped in. So this is me and Missy Hawkins, who's the mammals curator at the Smithsonian Museum, National Museum of Natural History, with Mutton. We're measuring Mutton, and that's Karen on the far right on Missy's laptop on Zoom, instructing us on what measurements we should get for her. So that's what's happening there. And so Karen had taken these measurements from Mutton and had incorporated this data with measurements from living dogs, as well as the dimensions from archaeological dog skulls that Ian had kindly provided. And she also incorporated the information from archival records and oral histories about the physical appearance of woolly dogs in order to create this this reconstruction of Mutton. And I like this slide because you can really see the amount of work it takes into doing this that I think is kind of being de-emphasized now with the rising popularity of like the AI image generators. But yeah, there's a lot of work and love that went into this. And so she had created this reconstruction of Mutton, and this is one of the figures in our published paper. And we have Mutton standing there with these other Spitz dogs there for scale. So these are Spitz dogs. This is kind of a general descriptor of the sort of hairy dogs with curly tails and pointed ears and a pointed nose, like the American Eskimo dog, the Alaskan Malamute, the Samoyed, the Alaskan Husky, and the Finnish Spitz. They are the similarity in the physical appearance is due to convergence. These dogs are actually, some of these dogs are actually not that related to each other at all. For example, the American Eskimo dog is primarily European ancestry. The Malamutes and Husky and the Samoyeds, they're known as Arctic dogs. And then we have Mutton, which I'll show to you very shortly, is neither of them. And yeah, so you can see that Mutton is relatively small in comparison to the Malamutes and Huskies and the Samoyeds. So Ian had talked a little bit about this before, and so this figure here, it shows the kind of osteometric methods that are predominant in these in the archaeological studies of dogs from the Pacific Northwest. And up until now, the only way to determine whether a dog is a smaller dog or a presumed woolly dog or a larger presumed hunting dog is by looking at the measurements of their bones. So Ian had made this figure, and he took the metatarsal 4 measurements of Mutton and had compared it to measurements from Susan Crockford's so-called type 2 dogs. These are archaeological village or hunting dogs, and the so-called type 1 dogs, which are archaeological woolly dogs. And you can see that Mutton's metatarsal, you can see that the metatarsal forelength of the village dogs are longer than those of the archaeological woolly dogs. And Mutton's metatarsal 4 falls within the distribution of the archaeological village dogs, these larger dogs. But I mean, we have the pelt of Mutton, and he is not, he clearly isn't a short-haired dog, and he was named in records as being a dog whose hair was used for textiles by the Coast Salish. So this kind of shows that you can't necessarily go by these classical morphometric characters when differentiating between these dog types. You do need other forms of data. And so this is where DNA comes in. So this image here is of it's the BioBubble Ancient DNA Lab, which is part of the Smithsonian and it's called, within this large complex called the Museum Support Center outside of Washington, D.C. in Suitland, Maryland. It's about 7 miles outside of D.C. And so all of the lab work on Mutton was done by Missy Hawkins, by Xiaolei Liu, who is a postdoc at the museum, and also Logan Kistler. He's a curator in anthropology at the museum too. So in any case, that was where this lab facility, this biobubble, was where they had done the lab work in extracting the DNA from tiny pieces, little cut up pieces of Mutton's skin, and had made the preparations leading to sequencing of his genome. So this then is one of the results of the analysis from Mutton's genome. So this is what we call a time tree of mitochondrial genomes, and these are small circular genomes that are present in many copies inside of each cell in your body, and it's maternally inherited. And so in this tree here, it's representing mitochondrial genomes from more than 200 ancient and modern dogs. And this tree essentially shows how these different genomes relate to each other using this Bayesian statistical method of creating a model. So it essentially estimates how many years ago in time did the ancestors of these dogs here, did they diverge from each other? And so we see Mutton is grouped here at the very far end with that's that little sky blue dot there at the far left. Mutton is grouped with other pre-colonial dogs. And these are dogs that were found only in the Americas, and they're now extinct. They went extinct after the introduction of European dogs. Zooming up on the tree, and within this mitochondrial grouping, we found that Mutton's lineage is estimated to be between 18 1,850 to 4,800 years old. So quite an ancient lineage that mutton comes from. So I also wanted to further explore mutton's ancestry, and I then performed another analysis, a statistical analysis called F3 outgroup statistics. And this figure, it shows the results of these tests. So you have, and it basically shows the ancient and modern dogs that are with the greatest similarity to mutton, that look, their genomes are most similar to mutton. So the more to the right, the more similar they are to mutton. And these black dots, they represent individual dogs in this data set. And these horizontal lines here, they represent the different dog populations, which are color-coded here. You can see at the bottom, like the Siberian Arctic dogs, the European dogs, the dogs from the whole East Asia, etc. And so we found that mutton is most similar to the ancient pre-colonial dogs here on the right in black. And this includes a 4,500-year-old dog from the Portageois archaeological site in Newfoundland, and also a 1,000-year-old dog from the Wayanoke Hatch archaeological site in Virginia. And since mutton, he post-dates European colonization, I had then tested whether he had other genetic ancestry from other introduced lineages. And this is essentially I'm exploring whether there's ancestry in mutton's genome that's not pre-colonial, but from a different dog population, like dogs from the Arctic or Africa. So on this figure, then, the more to the right, the more positive the result, and the more the test dog that I'm testing is similar to mutton, and the more to the left, the more negative the result, the more the test dog is similar to a pre-colonial dog. And so I did this analysis on like 250 dogs or something. And we see that, is it here? Yeah. And we see that the dogs that are most similar to mutton are modern European dogs on the far right, and you can see represented with the aqua here. And also the dogs that are most to the left, the most similar to the pre-colonial dogs, which we used the Portageois dog as the proxy. The dog population most similar to the pre-colonial dog was the dingo, and this is because of the shared ancestry that dingoes have with pre-colonial dogs in Asia, like deep ancestry. So the next step then is to estimate how much of mutton's genome is comprised of pre-colonial and European ancestry. And then I had found that he is about 84% pre-colonial dog and 16% modern European dog. So it's about his great-great-grandfather the scale of his great-great-grandfather may have been a European dog. And finally, I wanted to investigate the genetic mechanisms for woolliness. I wanted to see if there are any specific genes in mutton that could point to his unique woolly phenotype. So I performed something called a selection analysis on his genome, and also compared him to other dogs and other canids. And I had found 28 genes in Mutton that are associated with biological processes that are linked with hair and skin. And one of the genes that I found is called KINK2, and it's associated with woolly hair in humans. So all of these results essentially show that the very unique, the special phenotype of woolly dogs, they were developed by the Coast Salish peoples over a very long time, over millennia of careful dog management. All right, back to Liz.
Okay, so in the interviews, it was interesting to find that there was a lot of colonial policies that also impacted the existence of the dogs. And one of the first things that really impacted them was diseases like smallpox. But smallpox wasn't the only disease, and smallpox didn't happen once; it happened many times here on the coast. And as Michael Pavel said, the most devastating was the scourge of pandemics that swept through communities. Once the people who took care of the dogs had passed away, it was difficult to take care of the dogs. So if you have 95% of a village wiped out because of disease, who's left to feed the dogs, care for the dogs? And even Rena Point Bolton, she was 95 when I interviewed her. She said, everybody died from smallpox except my great-grandmother, Mrs. Vieder. They were told they couldn't do their cultural things. There was the police, the Indian agents, and the priests. The dogs were not allowed, and she had to get rid of them. So her great-grandmother had kept dogs, and dogs were a symbol of wealth or high status. And the Indian agents wanted everybody to have the same status. So if you had woolly dogs, it showed that you were higher status. And so her great-grandmother was told to get rid of them. So that had a big impact on them as well. Yeah, okay, Audrey, next one. I think we've covered a lot of this. And one thing I want to emphasize is that the woolly dogs did come from here. 4,000 years of breeding, careful breeding, to bring out that long hair and the woolliness of the hair. And they didn't disappear just to cheap Hudson's Bay Company blankets. They disappeared because of diseases. And it might also include European dog diseases too. But it wasn't economics, but also colonial policies had an impact on them too. Okay, next one. When I interviewed people and the advisory committee, I asked everyone how would they like the information shared aside from an academic paper. And overwhelmingly, people said use as many visuals and media and audio that you can. And Logan had a friend that is a filmmaker, Kirk French, and he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania or Penn State. And he teaches film or documentary, how would you call that?
Ethnographical
yeah,
filmmaking.
Filmmaking, yeah. And he's actually working right now on a documentary of Nanook of the North. He's working closely with that community because it's been 100 years since that documentary was done. So he's now involved in the project, and he came out last year for a week, and we interviewed various people, and he's put an 8-minute teaser together, and he's coming out again next week, and we'll do another week of interviewing, and he'll put a documentary together that'll be available to the public, and I think that'll be a really good way of getting the information out to the Coast Salish people especially. Okay.
All right, back to me. And so yeah, so we're almost done here. I just want to point out that that our study was published in Science magazine last December, and we didn't make the cover, but we did make the cover. So that was pretty cool. We have a byline on the top left there. And there had been a lot of media that had reported on the study. And it had been very, very exciting to see all of this that had come out, like all of these from all of these venues. We even made the physical cover of the Washington Post when that article came out. And there's still media coverage coming out that had just come out recently. Wait, no, right. Also, yeah, we also went viral. This science communicator on TikTok, Zeke, he had done a really wonderful TikTok on the study, and you can see that it's gotten 144,000 views, and then that had also opened other conversations via TikTok to other members of the Salish community, and they were sharing their stories as well, from their traditions, and it's really cool. And yeah, it was also named by it was one of the Smithsonian's most popular discoveries in 2023, and just last week, I think, we were featured in Quirks and Quarks, which is CBC Radio 1's science podcast, and they had interviewed Stephen Point and Violet Elliott for the podcast as well. And I had a listen to it the other day. It is really well done. I thought they were so inspired by apparently the producers are so inspired by the story that they decided to make a full episode on dogs, and then we closed it out with a pretty big segment. So that's really cool. And yeah, that's about it. I just want to say thank you to all of the wonderful people who are a part of this, have been a part of this project, and hopefully will continue to work together on learning even more about woolly dogs. Hopefully this is only the beginning. And yeah, this is what the cover should have been, in my opinion. And just on the right, this is a beautiful beautiful painting by Elliot Whitehill from Snuneymuxw First Nation, of a woman surrounded by her woolly dogs. All right.
Well, thank you very much. What a great presentation, and I'm so thankful. In terms of your visuals, this is all recorded, so if you want to use it for your students or community, it's on, and I'll send it to you, but it's on our PNWAS YouTube channel for members and beyond. Questions? We probably have some questions. If you want to react by raising your hand, I'm sure they'll be happy to. I'm not sure what, but anyway, there might be some chat questions. any questions? Raise your hand and feel free to discuss it. Be sure to turn on off your mute.
Dale, I have a question. This is Karen Samdahl.
Hi.
Hi. I've been really interested in the woolly dogs since I first heard about them. I heard somewhere that some woolly dogs had been put on an island to keep them safe from Western European dog diseases. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, some communities did keep them on islands. There's a lot of reports that dogs were kept on islands, but it's not clear whether it was the hunting dogs that were kept on islands or the wool dogs. In some communities, we know it was the wool dogs. And it depended on whether there was islands available. Some communities used pens. Some kept them inside. Some people kept hunting dogs or the village dogs, hunting dogs anyway, penned up. So it's going to be a mixture. But yes, they did definitely keep them separated so that they wouldn't breed with the hunting dog. The other thing we don't know is were they just separated during a breeding season, for example. So
yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Karen, I could add, I know it's set out, and they're about to go to nearby. What Island would be a hair dog island.
Oh, okay.
And for us at OZ, it was OZ Island.
Okay.
And speaking of feeding them, like Chris talked about, evidently my stories are they were really well fed. And I'm not sure, Chris, if that would help the hair quality, but I mean, they were not. They were kept separate on these islands, according to them, and but well fed. Every day a woman would go out with her canoe and make sure they were well fed. And any thoughts about the hair quality, Chris? If you did that, I don't think corn's what they fed on.
Not normally, right? No, that's a great question. And so whenever we look at stable isotope analyses, the main kind of questions we're able to ask isn't so much the quantity of food or even the quality in ways that like we would define quality, which can obviously have like a lot of definitions, right? It's about those different proportions of food. How much terrestrial, like low level, like plant food are they eating versus this higher order marine food? What are those different proportions? Something that I didn't talk about in my slides is the other clue we can get is in instances where animals are just very ill or under some sort of intense bodily stress, such as starvation. So it's not that we're seeing a lot of food, but in instances where we see very little food or a lot of chronic illness, we can see some changes as the body basically eats itself, right? But it doesn't seem like Mutton had that kind of stress on him. And that's a little interesting because, of course, Gibbs had written in his journal that Mutton had been ill, right? And so that would suggest if we're not seeing the isotopic record of that illness, what that might mean is that illness was acute. It came very quickly, whatever Mutton was suffering from.
And maybe to add to that, I don't think they have the islands. Michael Pavel may not, have islands in Skoke area. I don't know, but they kept them in pins. And I forgot to point out, this is a Skoke necklace that he talks about with the hair dogs, and also showed a pin he mentions. And this design was actually found on basket rims from the ancient Posette site. So they're probably being traded up from Skoke. And Michael, did you want to say anything about
Oh, absolutely. And I do want to say, wherever they were kept, they were cared for constantly. This is an entity who you wanted to groom. you wanted to keep clean, you wanted to pet, comb, and if you don't, it actually affects the quality of the wool. And you would really understand the amount of effort required in constantly grooming. Now, some may feel comfortable leaving a village, a family of dogs on an island, and come back periodically. But the Tuaru, the Tuana, the Skokomic, would never do that. They would never leave them alone. They were relatives.
Hmm.
And as relatives, we cared for them because they also cared for us. And there was a site I found actually, Dale, on Hood Canal that was perfect. It was somewhat secluded. It had a high hill so that it could be protected. It was on the water, and it was an ideal location for raising and caring for a village of woolly dogs. These were pets. These were grandmothers, grandfathers, aunties, uncles, sons, daughters, cousins. And they gave us a unique perspective on genealogy because we would have to, over the course of centuries, of millennia, know that it was important to mix the breeds so that you would have the highest quality wool. The science associated with it was really quite fantastic and elevated. I want to say we were veterinarians of the highest order. And the science to be able to maintain that had to be acquired over time. So Dale, I just want to come back and say, whatever we did to take care of our relatives, we did so with great attention to detail. And one of the things that we always appreciated was the teaching that they provided us, because we forget the woolly dogs not only provided us with wool, and that wool was actually ordained by the Creator to infuse the power to hold prayer. And when it held prayer, that was energy. Some may call it a thermal quality, but in fact, it holds the spiritual power of prayer. And not all fibers do that. And before I go on and on and on, I do want to say that wherever we did take care of them, we had villages. They had villages, and they had families in those villages, and we would allow them to take care of themselves as we would take care of them, and then they would return the teaching. You know, the most important teaching that woolly dogs provided us, not only about the power of prayer, holding their wool would have, by the Creator's blessing, hold the power of prayer. They taught us at least three very important things, and that's one, unconditional love. Second, loyalty. And third, commitment to family. And early on in our evolution as human, and as we were elevating our conscience, we saw that these teachings that the woolly dog provided us proved invaluable in how we raised our children. We didn't come into this world with unconditional love. We had to learn it from the entities around us, and one of the entities was the woolly dog. So I'll just pause right there before I go on and on. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I should point out, this is Andy Peterson's art from Skoke. And,
right on.
Thank you. And it, you know, this symbol is so important too, as far as being recognized across the region and, you know, traded into OZ. Okay, other
Dale, I just see there's some questions in the chat. Somebody wanted to know about the length of the hair, and certainly 3 inches for sure, but it could have been longer. I think when Chris did her cutting, it was three for mutton. It was about 3 inches, I think, and some of the oral histories talk about it being about 3 inches, and it could be, some communities did talk about it being shorn twice a year, so that might mean, you know, a 6-inch growth throughout the year. And somebody else asks about other cultures make textiles with canned hair or wool. Yes, other cultures did, but they didn't. The dog usually had a different purpose or function, and it was secondary that they had the wool. So like a guard dog, for example, in the Pyrenees, they would make wool things out of that. But the dog wasn't kept separated from other dogs, whereas with the Coast Salish woolly dog, it was definitely focused on the wool and preserving that wool quality.
Yeah, I would point out too that domesticating an animal for its hair quality only really happened 2 places in the Americas, and both for the wealth. One is here, and the other is Peru, where the alpaca is bred for its hair quality, and again for the wealth. But that's a full-blown agricultural society with 15 million people. So this area stands out as one of the main areas that the wealth in blankets was so important. Other questions?
Oh, I just want to add another bit to the conversation about textiles with dog hair and dog wool. I had mentioned earlier Xiaolei Liu. So this research actually had inspired her to look into look into textile arts of the Aboriginal Taiwanese and she's from Taiwan. And apparently there are textiles in museums in, I think, Japan and the British Museum. So these are not blankets. These are like jackets. And the fabric is very, very different looking. So apparently there was a practice of dog hair, specific types of dogs being used to create these very taffeta looking fabrics, and the hair would be incorporated with the plant fibers there, which is rami, and very little is known about the history, about the ethnography of these textiles, and but yeah, they were also known as like the lion dogs because of their long hair. And we haven't been able to look at what these textiles look like in person. I've only been looking at the photographs of it, but but I can imagine the amount, like the hair would have been very different, much finer, to be able to be made into like taffeta like fibers. But yeah, so that is another work in progress, and yeah, thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Could I ask you one thing, Audrey, on looking at mutton? Well, no, let's get to one of the questions that Helen Carlson posed. How do Ozette dog genetics compared to mutton? Is there a possibility to see archaeologically what the genes are in the what are considered hair dogs by Paul Gleason, to see the genetics?
Well, that's what I'm hoping to do, to follow up on this work, to be able to study the archaeological dogs from the Pacific Northwest, to see how closely related these different these dogs are, if we can tell if they come from different populations, if they have the same sort of woolly dog genes, so to speak, and also to see if we can like be able to answer more questions about like the functions of the dogs in relation to the size of dogs as well. Because I read in Paul Gleason's master's thesis that, for example, that hunting dogs, there were different types of them, and one type of hunting dog is actually quite small. You know, it seems like they are more terrier-like, and their purpose is to chase the elk and the deer in order and to an area so that the human can like capture or kill the animal. And this kind of goes against this assumption that, you know, hunting dogs have to be these big dogs. And so yes, hopefully with genetic analysis, we can be able to answer some of these questions anyway.
Yeah, I would add that that size may not matter so much, but I think where they did keep them on islands, a smaller dog doesn't eat much, and in competition with the bigger ones on the island, they would survive, or the big one may have needed more, but also I think it's just really the hair quality you'd be looking for size wise. I saw big ones that look very woolly and small ones. So as he said, that Susan's thing about type 1 and type 2 and Mutton being type 2 or a village dog really may not matter. I mean, if he had the hair quality right, and she was quite right too, and without genetics saying that she felt, I thought it was ambitious that these dogs were bred for over 5,000 years. You know, when Susan Crawford's thing, and he, you know, Ian may want to add to that, but.
Oh, sure. Just to say that those two box plots that compared to the size of the metatarsal for mutton, you know, that is one of the great things about Susan's book is, you know, she measured dogs from multiple sites and, you know, measured the same bone over and over, and they all came out with these two clusters of a large and a small. So that said, you know, that was the basis for her types of, and they were consistent with the Coast Salish wool dog type, but in Macaw territory as well. So there's just this bigger sample that's needed to look at dogs' body sizes. And, you know, there is variation, of course. And, you know, Liz's mention of the map at the beginning of the presentation in the Sunshine Coast as a, you know, place in proximity to major mountains and mountain goats, perhaps. And there's a, you know, quite a large number of needs for dogs in different places in the Coast Salish world even. So I'm just, you know, fascinated to get more people thinking about dog sizes, dog types, and this genetic pathway is such a rich pathway, but it can't tell how big a dog is, but it can, you know, so there's, and then there's the isotopic path to look at dog diet and think about all the different kinds of foods that might have been, you know, preferentially caught and collected for these valued relatives or family members or companions, and for all kinds of purposes. But of course, this very powerful holding of the heat that Michael mentioned, that's such an interesting path. So I have a link to a paper that Chris mentioned that I'm just going to paste in here, and I will that relates to some of those points. But
thank you. And I guess other thing is Randall Shaw did a big survey and found that there's no mountain goat remains in any of the Olympic Peninsula mountains. So they really created their own source, otherwise they'd have to trade it in. But how about Vancouver Island, Ian? Is there much for mountain goat on Vancouver?
There's late Pleistocene mountain goats up in the highlands, and that's like, you know, 14,000 years ago. Right,
Yeah, that's quite a
16,000
while.
years ago. There's a site on the west coast, but yeah, no mountain goats today, and in the late Holocene, as far as I can see from zooarchaeology.
Other questions on any of that? Anybody else? I have one question, and maybe Audrey can help with this. I kind of see these dogs that I've seen as not having up pointed ears. Did Mutton have really upright pointed ears, or did he have floppy ears like we see it depicted sometimes in Salish art too? But
because of the way that Mutton was, his pelt was dried, we can't really tell if his ears were upright or not. And also we can't tell if he had a curly tail or not. But he did have like little equilateral triangle ears. That was what he did have. So so we had decided to depict him as having upright pricked ears, because most of the descriptions of wool dogs were noted that they had upright ears. So but yeah, we can't say for sure.
any other questions? If you raise your hand, feel free to.
Oh, I had noticed Astrid had asked a question earlier if there's any plans to backbreed local dogs to create the woolly dog. And my understanding is that some communities have been trying to do that for quite some time. So yes.
Well, yeah. One thing I really like your genetic underpinning of woolliness, but could you tell me what woolly hair in humans looks like?
So the woolly kink too, that woolly hair gene that I had mentioned. So this isn't a gene, this is not the gene that's responsible for woolly hair in like humans of like African and ancestry. This actually came from dermatology study. It was published, it was a paper in a dermatology journal on skin disorders that were identified within this particular family. And I think somewhere in Asia, and in which they had this particular kind of skin disorder that included like patches of woolly hair, as well as I think scaly skin, like so problems with keratinization. And so, well, that's the thing with the discovery of a lot of genes in like human medical studies. It usually is because of some sort of disorder, and then you're able to find the genetic, and if you're lucky enough, you can find the genetic cause of that. And so that was what had happened for this particular gene. And so it's quite interesting to imagine that this gene results in possibly in a similar sort of phenotype in a completely different species.
I find it hard to find a good definition of what woolliness is, because if you've got curly hair, generally what happens is the hair all grows in a lock, and it comes out, and then it curls. But every individual hair tends to curl the same way. in the lock anyway, and you might have different locks. So I think what woolliness is the hair will come out, but one hair will come out like this, another hair will come out like that, and another one will come out like this, and you get this chaotic growth of hair. And what that does is create air pockets, and it's the air pockets that make the fiber warm, because it's the air that keeps it warm. So if you've got a lot of air pockets in the yarn, that's where the warmth comes from. And I think that's what's happening with dogs like Mutton.
One thing, Liz, you talk about Wickershams blankets. There is one that he used to have on his, as he was a judge, I guess, in our state, for his chair, his office chair.
Yeah, and it's
Sat
actually, it's in Alaska right now.
We saw it, Ed and I did at the University of Alaska, but it's a nice piece of textiles, but he pretty well wore it out.
I've got a photograph of him sitting on that chair with the blanket behind him. And if you open up the blanket, there's a couple of holes where the blanket was folded, and then he sat on that spot. You can actually see the wear and tear on that.
Right. Well, other comments on this? You say Ian said he has how many bat remains in your collection? How easy is it for you to show us those?
Oh, sorry. I have not looked at the trades.
Oh, you
I've
just
been
looked up
listening to
it,
all of you, and I've been sending you all random papers to random places. But I just had texted amazing work by Tina Lassisi at the University of Michigan about curly hair and hair morphology in humans and heat. But I don't think I can go find the bats right now, but we do have 13, and they're a variety of species, and I'm sure they are present somewhere archaeologically as well.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the speakers very much, and I hope if here in Seattle we also have two major welcome figures made by Andrew Wilbur Saigo, a Squaxin at the convention center, one a man and one a very pregnant woman with a basket and a child in the basket on the back. He's from Vermont. And so the Salish are putting their stamp on Seattle, particularly the male as they're there with a war club facing the city. And of course, Daniela's piece has just been put up, and that's Suquamish. So you can get over to the convention center. Might not be easy if you're stuck at the Burg, really so much there. But thank you all very much. Is there any last question? But I do want to thank you, and thanks, Dan. If you're with us still, Dan Mia, the next talk will be certainly on these capture artifacts, these things for Dendalian, which is another wealth item, like the currency, and herring rakes and those sort of things. We really appreciate more in line with that too, seeing something about how these resources are captured. Well, thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you then in the early fall, and maybe out when you're out here in our area, and hopefully Macades, you can some of you can make it out, and I do have that campground to think about, and it's the 100th anniversary of Macades, their 100th anniversary, so they're excited for sure. So thanks again, and it's midnight probably for Audrey in New York, but
thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks, Karen.
Thank you to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris and Liz and Ian too for coming in from all over the country or all North America. Bye-bye now. Have a good evening.